This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City with a little bit of a cold this week. If you follow news about Vietnam, and I assume you do if you're listening to this podcast, you know that investment is one of the biggest topics of the moment. Foreign direct investment is particularly important, and at times it feels like exports by multinational corporations are propping up a majority of the economy. And data tends to back that up. Vietnam has one of the highest trade to GDP ratios in the world. As a result, regulations from other jurisdictions at both the national and corporate levels have an outsized impact on FDI investments and operations here in Vietnam. The EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, a tariff on carbon-intensive imports to the bloc that goes into full effect in 2026, is an example, as is the EU Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR. To be sure, there are valid criticisms of these regulations as a form of economic colonialism, and I'll add links to some of those in the show notes if you're interested. But exporters in Vietnam, whether domestic or foreign, can't ignore them. On the corporate side, meanwhile, ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, is the focal point for many of the world's most well-known companies, and in many cases kind of intersect with national level regulations. So the likes of H&M and Lego are striving to eliminate as much carbon from their supply chains as possible, and numerous companies have net zero emissions pledges, just like Vietnam and numerous other nations. Vietnam obviously has a lot going for it when it comes to foreign investment, but as discussed in last week's episode, energy is a particularly difficult hurdle for investors with strong ESG commitments, meaning renewable energy. There's also a pressing need for upskilling workers, gender equality, regulations to catalyze green investment, and so on. So where do we go from here? Today's guests are Mimi Vu and Van Lee, partners at Raise Partners, an organization that is a collaborative partnership sharing expertise with organizations that contribute to the betterment of humanity. So we discussed their diverse professional backgrounds, especially in fundraising, and how this brought them into the ESG space. Criticisms of ESG from some corners of the political spectrum, the importance of multi-stakeholder cooperation in addressing environmental, social, and governance issues, and how Vietnam's challenges present huge investment opportunities in the right situations. Let's get to my conversation with Mimi and Van. Mimi and Van, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Mike. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, of course. So, as I mentioned in the intro, you both are partners at Raise Partners, saying partners twice there. But I was curious if we could kind of start talking about how you both have very diverse and interesting backgrounds, how those backgrounds and development relates to and is kind of merging into ESG investing. And actually, maybe to start, what is ESG and how would you define it?
I would say that ESG, to explain, is a framework and tools that represent environmental, social, governance, corporate governance metrics, right? And I was discussing with a friend yesterday how that's different than, say, sustainability or development work. And one thing that we sort of came to alignment about was that it helps us ask all the right questions about companies and their impact in the world, right? So by giving us sort of this framework of environmental, social, governance metrics, it helps you both internally look at your company's resilience, right, and strength, and also gaps, but then also the impact that you're having on the local economy, on the world. And I think that's probably a pretty good way to explain it.
Maybe do you have anything to add to that?
So what Van said was very comprehensive. And the other thing about ESG is that it also helps assess internal and external risk. And especially it's very, very important for frontier and emerging markets like Vietnam and other countries in similar situations to understand as they grow, as they develop, where are the risks and what are the opportunities to invest in the solutions to head off these risks and mitigate the risks and avoid the risks and prevent them. So
thank you for that. And then kind of back to the original question, how did your backgrounds kind of converge on this topic?
Well, Van and I, we are two very separate people, but but we have very similar backgrounds. So we're both Vietnamese American, daughters of refugees, both from the Midwest. I'm from Michigan originally, and Vanna's from Illinois. And we've been in Vietnam for roughly about the same amount of time. I've been here for almost 18 years, and Vanna's been here for almost 17 years. And both of us have worked in the majority of our careers in the NGO sector. So in Vietnam, working on, for nonprofit organizations on everything from access to education to climate change, adaptation, mitigation, gender equality, support for ethnic minority communities, public health, clean water and sanitation, economic empowerment. And I'm also an expert in human trafficking, modern slavery, and labor migration.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we both worked, and on our very separate but parallel path is that we both excel in setting up multi-stakeholder partnerships and looking at the situation from an intersectional standpoint. So, for example, when we look at, how do you support climate change adaptation in the Mekong Delta, we don't look at it, and we've never looked at it only from a pure environmental standpoint. You also have to look at the human involvement, policies, economic influence. People make decisions based on how much money they can earn to support their families. So there's culture in there as well. So the solutions that we develop include all sorts of partners, and then also looks at the bigger picture. And the solutions don't necessarily have to address every single thing, but you have to be aware, and this is what ESG frameworks help, is that you are aware of what the potential consequences or impacts are. And so that will help you avoid any unintended negative consequences or impacts as you develop your program. So so that was just all in the development world, working for various NGOs. And on top of that, we're both known for being very good fundraisers as well. And so we worked very, very closely with our donors, who were private sector, large multinational companies. Like the donors that I worked with in my old NGOs were, companies like Walmart and Victoria's Secret and John Lewis and Clark's. And working with them in a way that our relationship was one of partner rather than your typical like donor charity. And so that meant that the NGOs that we worked for were not necessarily placed in the CSR bucket, but more into the what is now known as ESG, but back then it didn't exist, because our work was viewed as integral to the company's operations in Vietnam. So, for example, every year I would have conversations with my large multinational donors to talk about strategy. And we were always a budget line item in their annual, in their fiscal year, right, in the annual budget. And that was how we were used to working with private sector. On top of that, our other donors were philanthropists who run family offices and are investors. So when we switched over to, transitioned over to private sector and ESG work, the work itself actually was not that difficult because it's, essentially what we're doing before, but now from the private sector side. And so what we really see is there's this merging or this evolution of the two, development is on one end, finance and economy is on the other. The two are now meeting because of the nature of the world and what needs to happen and what needs to be invested in order to make sure that Vietnam develops as well as possible.
I don't have much more to add on that, except that just to sort of sum up what Mimi said, I think one of the things that from that transition from our development work to ESG, I think that we were used to working with companies and other partners in a way that addressed the fact that we all are not operating in a bubble, right? We're not just operating from a company side thinking about profit, because actually we are operating in a developing country that has challenges. And so those things need to be addressed through partnership. And so I think that made that transition into ESG and sustainability work easy.
Okay. And Mimi, I mean, you mentioned in the past, some of this would be maybe more considered CSR. I guess that phrase hasn't completely phased out, but ESG, you see more. I didn't prep you guys for this question, but of course there's some skepticism. I mean, we're all Americans. America has its own political, let's say, complexities. But certainly around the world, I'm sure there's skeptics of ESG. What would you say to somebody who maybe just thinks this is like another fad in the corporate world or something along those lines?
I have said this. I have had to answer that question multiple times. So I was on the board of AmCham in Ho Chi Minh City, American Chamber of Commerce in Ho Chi Minh City last year. So meeting with a lot of U.S. government delegations, and it's really funny because when they came over, and I was taking part of the meeting as a board member, but also as the ESG person in the meeting. And when it comes to actual reality, there's no discussion, no question about it, because you're on the ground and you see and you understand what the actual situation is, and the politics just fall away. I think and this is probably mostly in the West, the idea of ESG is one that's very siloed. And so when they think of ESG and they talk about ESG, it's very like, the majority of the discussion is centered around climate and energy, which are very hot button topics for whatever reason in the US and in the West. Whereas for emerging markets, frontier markets like Vietnam, developing countries, it is a reality. There's no escaping the fact. And it does not matter how rich of a country or poor of a country you are. When you are located in a region like Vietnam, like Southeast Asia and Asia at large, you're much closer, much more affected collectively by things like climate change. We see the typhoon cycles, the storm cycles that come down. They hit the Philippines, they hit Vietnam, they hit Japan, right? And those are vastly different economies, but we all suffer from the same situation. And so that reality that we are all in this together forces us to think, okay, how do we figure out the solution? We can't ignore them, because to ignore them would literally be, at our peril. It threatens our actual survival. Whereas I think in the West, there's a little bit more geographical isolation. And so things that affect all of us here in Asia very acutely and immediately don't necessarily there's a lag time, right? And even within the U.S., because it's such a big country, if something, I remember the Hurricane Katrina like 20-something years ago, I was living in New York City at the time, and everything was happening in Louisiana. And, we're watching it. We were holding fundraisers in New York, but it really felt like I was, holding a fundraiser for Haiti or somewhere else, and not actually somewhere in America. So I think there's that geographical influence as well. And, for us, the ESG, it's really, maybe this is also partly because we're pragmatic Asians on that sense, but we can very, clearly connect the dots and recognize the adverse effects that not dealing with all the challenges related to ESG and development, how that can, the negative effects on our growth, our development, our people, and ultimately the economy. And, the thing about, I love about being in Vietnam is that we don't have the issues with, ideology, religious, political identity, whatever, what have you, as there is in the West that's influencing the way things are done here. Here, it's just very pragmatic, and it's more about, I need to do better, make money, send my kid to school so that my family has a better chance. My community has a better chance. My country has a better chance. And that really is at the core of Vietnamese, and I think more like Southeast Asian, East Asian cultures as well. So we're much more pragmatic about dealing with these types of issues and connecting it to financial decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the geographic isolation you mentioned is definitely interesting. I mean, I'm from New Orleans, so I lived through, we evacuated, but lived through Katrina, and certainly noticeable when something happens in New York, for example. It gets much more, although Katrina got a lot of attention, obviously, but that's kind of a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, but it was like another country. It was almost... That's how we viewed it from the North. I didn't, but it felt like it.
Sure. So back to Vietnam, kind of more specifically. What do you see as ESG? I mean, and again, environment, social governance, three separate but also very interlinked topics. What do you see as some of the challenges or risks here for ESG, and what are alternatively, what are the kind of investment opportunities for that? I mean, I know, for example, energy kind of cuts across all three of these. My previous episode was about financing the energy transition, which is a huge challenge everywhere. Certainly for foreign investors here is a big topic, because if you're, an H&M supply chain, you need carbon, fossil fuel free power supply, which is difficult here at the moment. But anyway, what do you see as kind of the big ESG challenges, and what are investment opportunities off the back of that?
I'm trying to think of how to put it succinctly. I think one challenge, right, especially you already highlighted, Mike, is that energy piece. And I think the reason why that's so challenging, in fairness to Vietnam, is because this is a huge transformation, right? The scale of what needs to happen in Vietnam in order for green energy to take hold, for us to adopt clean energy, right? The scale that it means changing the power framework, right? It means allowing international companies, developers, both internationally and locally, to really invest a lot of money into something that feeds into everyone's power grid, right? So I think the reason why we see sort of the fits and starts of that, and also is because it's going along with the way regulation is happening, right? Mm-hmm. The clarity, the guidance, the decrees, all the decisions that come out, and the industry having to wait for the next signals from the government. And that makes sense when we think about how big this market potentially is, right? Vietnam has a really long coastline. And so for wind power, for hydro, we could potentially do a lot. And I think from the investor side, that's very challenging, right? To see where and when is the right time to sort of accelerate their money into Vietnam, to see how that pays off. Mimi, maybe you can speak to the opportunities in investing in supply chain, the future of Vietnam's supply chain.
Yeah, I think for me, from the S side, workforce and workforce development is a big challenge, but there's also a lot of opportunity. So Vietnam right now has, we're still in the golden age of our workforce, where the majority of our population is of working age, but that's only going to last for so many more years. We'll start aging out, and so there's a bunch of demographic issues that are looming for Vietnam right now. We need to really look at the workforce development and related to that gender and underserved communities situation very, very clearly and very strategically, and act on it now. So we, as Vietnam, one of the centerpieces of the country's economic strategy is labor export, right? We are, as Vietnamese people, we are in serious demand, number one demand for labor within the Asia region. So countries like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and increasingly now New Zealand. We send about 100,000 workers per year to Japan. We're 1/3 of all foreign workers in New Zealand right now. But not only that, we are also one of the top, if not the top, recruited foreign workers for certain European countries, mainly the Eastern and Central European countries. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, Germany. So all of these countries are suffering severe labor shortages in the hundreds of thousands, between usually 400 or 500,000 workers. They're needed to be imported per year. And Vietnamese people, especially speaking about Europe, they've had a long history and very good reputation of being migrant workers in Europe. And this goes back to the 1980s and 1990s when Vietnam had its labor export program. And so even to this day, when I speak to, companies, employers in Europe and government officials, there's still this perception or this treatment of Vietnamese workers as the model minority migrant worker, right? We work really hard and we don't cause any trouble. And so we're in high demand. And then for Asia, it's definitely, closer, again, that reputation for working really hard. And also, closer cultural connections or cultural background, rather than workers from countries further away. So there's that. So we are a large supplier of export workers outbound, right? But at the same time, we're trying to build up our manufacturing hub, or Vietnam's position as a manufacturing hub in the global supply chain, and move up the value. So we know that the U.S. government wants the shift of semiconductor production to other countries, especially, for example, assembly, testing, packaging to Vietnam. That means that Vietnam also has to supply tens of thousands of workers. The number was thrown around was around 50,000, but I think it's been revised, but still significant.
Yeah, I was wondering where that number came from, because it was almost like became talismanic. And anyway.
Yeah. So the number has been revised, but it's still a lot, right? And that internally we need to supply for this part of production. And But the problem is that when we think about recruitment of workers for labor export, it's very much about the lower skilled, lower educated workers who still make a lot of money. For example, in Germany, working as kitchen staff at a Vietnamese restaurant, your starting salary is between 2,500 to 3,000 euros per month, right? If you're working and you're treated well and, everyone is doing everything properly, right? That's your starting salary, which, was a lot more, at least double what a factory worker would earn here in Vietnam. So in terms of recruiting workers for the supply chain here and supporting Vietnam's move up the value chain, we need to think about not just salary, but what are the other incentives to provide for Vietnamese workers so that they are willing to go through the training process, the education. It's going to be at least 2 years vocational or technical training school to be able to be qualified to work in the semiconductor supply chain. And that's just at the lowest level. And then their salaries will be less, but what are the other incentives, right? And who are you going to recruit to make sure that you have a stable workforce? And that's going to be women and people from underserved communities, like people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, et cetera, outside of the urban areas. So the investments that you're talking about when you say, okay, I need to recruit workers, it's not going to be made in the cities. It's not going to be made. You're not going to want to invest in technical schools or vocational school in Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi because there's plenty of those. You need to be establishing them in the second tier, third tier cities and regions of Vietnam, and then working in partnership with, the local authorities, the local civil society organizations to do the outreach into the villages to recruit the students and then pipeline them, basically send them to school and then pipeline them directly into employment into the companies.
I would say another area for opportunity and challenge for ESG investing, right, in Vietnam now is agribusiness, because Vietnam is still a really important producer for food. And so part of that ESG lens and looking at the investment space in food in Vietnam will look at the way that Vietnam is able to sort of green and make very inclusive those value chains in rice, coffee, cashews. And then the way that we will be able to sort of leverage nature-based solutions for shrimp, for example, or other products that are coming out of Vietnam in anticipation of exporting them to the European markets, right? So the way that we sort of can accelerate that through investment and through pilots of climate-smart agriculture, I think is a really big opportunity that I hope bears fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose especially with, European Union's new carbon border adjustment mechanism and these other regulations that are going to have a really big impact. I know there's some criticism out there of these policies, but they're coming, and countries are going to have to deal with that.
Yep.
So we've talked about, again, plenty of opportunities here. Nobody denies that, of course. But what kind of partnerships are needed to, create and channel these investments? Again, you talked at the start about how you both have a background in kind of multi-stakeholder projects and work. So there's a lot of stakeholders in all of these areas we've been discussing. But so what kind of partnerships are needed?
Yeah, I'll start, I guess. So I think what we're seeing, going back again to that agriculture space question, is some really interesting partnerships, both on a large scale, like from development financing with Vietnamese companies that helps them bring in the kind of technology that they will need to sort of deal with greening their production and also making their supply chain resilient and transparent, right? So there's those partnerships, and I'll give an example of that in a minute. And then there's also smaller partnerships between like philanthropists and communities. And what those end up looking like is that with that sort of blended finance, philanthropy money, they can sort of take on pilots that are a little bit more risky, right? Maybe new innovations, new models in the way that people are doing things or the way that they're working with communities in a way that advances that model, right? Once that you sort of build a proof of concept. So in terms of like big partnerships, an example that I think Nini can speak to probably better than me is recently the Dutch Development Bank gave a big loan to Lovejoy Group, which is a rice company, rice conglomerate. And that will enable them in order to do a lot of things. They will bring in climate smart technology. They will work with farmers. They will use, satellite and drones to do all the kinds of things to really reduce methane, reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in the rice industry on a really huge scale.
Yeah, no, and I will always, I'm be a fan of multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think part of it is because Van and I have both spent so much time working in the rural areas of Vietnam, in the highlands and the mountains, the border regions, the Mekong Delta, you name it. And that is really where the core of the action happens, is on the ground with the people. And it doesn't matter what issue you're working on. It could be environment, public health, education, whatever it is, because that's where you really see the local community working with the local government, working with local civil society organizations, and then, like randoms like me and Van and other BQ or expat going in there. And it's really because you need to have, so much of the success of anything that happens in Vietnam is based on a very clear understanding of the culture and also developing those very important on the ground relationships. And Vietnam is not a monolith, right? We have we have 54 ethnicities in this country. And then, we can talk about the regional differences between North, Central Vietnam, Southern Vietnam, Mekong Delta, that are on another podcast, but they exist and they're there. And to really have success in whatever program or investment you have to adapt it to the local environment and the local people. And in order to do that, you need to work with experts on the ground. And those experts on the ground are often, civil society working in partnership with the local authorities at the district level, commune, provincial levels. And so what we have seen a shift happening, and what we are encouraging when we talk about these multi-stakeholder partnerships from an investment standpoint is to include, and look at the role of civil society in these partnerships, but not from a CSR standpoint, not from a, do-gooder, we did some charity work standpoint, but really as a vendor, as a service provider, as that budget line item that I mentioned before, in the actual investment strategy and program or business operations. And that partnership can take on many different forms. You can talk, like Van mentioned, about the piloting initial investments that can take on a little bit more risk, working philanthropists, and then if the proof of concept works, then they can expand it into a larger investment. That we've seen happen, many times over, and to success. So one of the other investments that was announced last week during the Dutch trade mission here was also from FMO, and I think DFCD was involved too. So the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development and the Dutch Development Bank was investment in organic shrimp producer called Coming. And what was specifically for their program to support organic shrimp farming and also for organic shrimp farmers to be stewards of the mangrove forest in Cà Mau province, which is the home to one of the largest mangrove forests in Vietnam. And that will help then, develop the carbon market, right? But it's really and the project was started, I think 10 or 12 years ago as a partnership between SNV, which is a Dutch NGO, and Natureland, which is another NGO, and Comimex, the company, and also the local authorities, the local Melissa, and all the other departments responsible for investment and planning. And also because it's on the board, it's a border region, they also work with the border guards and the MONRE, the Ministry of Natural Resources. So it was this really wonderful multi-stakeholder partnership that's now been grown over the last decade and now has just been, approved for a lot of significant additional investment to expand their operations and programs. And hopefully that can be then, transferred to other sectors and other types of businesses. So things like that, where, you really see how these types of partnerships work on the ground. It gives you different perspective, and it also spreads the risk, and it makes it much easier to achieve greater impact, because the groups or the companies or the entities who are experts in their area are doing what they're supposed to be doing in partnership with other entities. And so then you get a much stronger, bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I mean, Kamau, obviously, of course, also one of the most climate vulnerable provinces in the country. Yeah, you make a great point about civil society, which unfortunately has taken a bit of a beating here in recent years, especially in the environmental space. With with the E, so that's one of the one of the letters of what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that can kind of serve as a model for, like you said, other industries or other provinces. And speaking of multi-stakeholders, a lot of people involved in ESG. Of course, you kind of need to bring those people together to talk, which you guys are working to do as well. So last May, you held, was it the first
Yeah,
Vietnam's
that's right.
first
Yeah.
ESG conference in
Investor
Vietnam? I was
conference.
there. Investor conference. Okay. How have you seen the conversation around ESG kind of evolve here since then?
Oh, it's definitely evolved. It's not even just since then, but I would say when Van and I first kicked around the idea of quitting our jobs and forming Raise Partners. This was in 2019, and when we were talking to people about it, private sector people, they were like, "What is this other? I'm already doing CSR. What is this other 3-letter acronym you're making me do?" And
Yep.
and there was that initial, belief that those two were the same thing, and that it was just a fad. It was just a trend. And I remember it was during COVID. 2020 and 2021 like blend together in my mind, but I think it was 2020. So Van and I are both like members of the Ho Chi Minh City government's Committee on Overseas Vietnamese, and regularly we'll be invited to meetings on various issues where the government asks overseas Gibao, BQ like us for advice on whether it's economic policy or migration policy or recommendations on investment, what have you. And there was one meeting that I was at the City Hall, and it was with the People's Committee and the party secretary. It was a larger meeting, and it was televised. And they asked me to speak, and I was not prepared, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to take this opportunity. It had to be in Vietnamese. And
Oh,
I
wow.
talked about the need to focus on ESG investing. And so I was trying to explain what it was, but I forgot the Vietnamese word for governance.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so I was like, A là môi trường S là xã hội. And I'm like, G là, and I was like, oh my God. I'm like, you know what I mean? But it was, and now to see, and I was not the first to talk about it, but it was definitely in the early days, right? Where you still had to explain what it was. And now you see it is a thing. Every company in Vietnam knows, local, international, that this is something they have to do. They may not know how to do it. And it's, it can be intimidating, but they know, okay, this is something I have to do because my shareholders are calling for it. My consumers are calling for it. My investors are calling for it. The government, the Vietnamese government is calling for it. My export market governments are calling for it. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was the annual Vietnam Business Forum meeting, and the theme was ESG. So it is something that's fully accepted and talked about as this is the strategy that we need to work with going forward. So I'm really, we're both really happy to see that the conversation has changed around it to a degree where, we talked before about the merging of our work, our previous work in development and investment strategy now. And I think there's nothing clearer than the fact that, so I was recently, as of Monday, appointed to the board of an investment fund, a London-listed investment fund called Vietnam Holding. And their fund manager, Dynam Capital, has long been an investor in Vietnam that has operated with ESG principles through their investment strategy. So they were never what would you call an ESG or impact focused fund, but they've always had an ESG lens. And it's from the outside, I'm not your traditional, I don't have the traditional finance background or someone you would expect to be appointed to the board of a London-listed investment fund that has outperformed the market. But
right.
At the same time, I do understand now why, a fund like Vietnam Holding would need someone of my background, which is from a development standpoint, from an ESG standpoint. I have my own separate network of my what I would call my former donors who are now, what I would call my impact investors, ESG investors, development finance institutions that I worked with previously from a government standpoint. And so I think that trend is increasing, and I hope it continues to increase, to see that diversity of boards of investment fund boards, not just from like a demographic standpoint, but also from this background standpoint. And that is like what has led us to create the Vietnam ESG Investor Conference.
If I can just add something to just a really quick point, which is I think the difference between last year and this year, a good example of how much ESG has sort of taken root in Vietnam is last year when I tried to do the business matching, it was actually very hard for me to find businesses that were ready to pitch to investors, right? Even on a very sort of small level or early stage level. Whereas now I think partially because of this sort of a growth of incubators and accelerator programs and other enablers of like SMEs to start looking for investment with an ESG lens, right? We see more in the climate space, in the sustainability space, in the social inclusion kind of space, right? How to enable people with disabilities to get into work. Those kinds of businesses are growing. And I think that is a big sign of the difference between last year and this year and the deepening of ESG into Vietnam.
Okay. Yeah, I can only imagine how much things have changed. I mean, things tend to change quickly here, so not surprising, I suppose. And
also the amount of funding available, right? There's more and more ESG impact marked funding coming into Vietnam or earmarked for Vietnam, especially from the development finance institution.
And then, this episode goes up the second week of April. The second ESG Investor Conference is May 16th and 17th. So when people are listening to this about a month away, I'll include a link in the show notes. But what are your kind of goals going into the second edition?
Well, number one goal is always to see deals and partnerships struck. We want to see connections. We want to see some sort of investment opportunities coming out of investments made coming out of the conference, because that's our way to show and prove to everyone that doing business and investing in the quote unquote right way actually makes money. And this is where the world needs to head and Vietnam needs to head going forward. So that is, first of all, above and beyond. Secondly, I think the theme for this year is building a resilient future for Vietnam. And so we are honing on this because when you have growth, you can have growth that's too fast. And I think there have been a lot of periods through Vietnam, we've all been here a long time, where we've seen the growth in specific sectors be too fast and it's too hot, and then you see a collapse because the foundation have not been built. It's like building any building. If you build it on, swampy land without building solid foundations, the building's going to collapse eventually, sooner rather than later. And not the same for anything here when you talk about investment in Vietnam. And so focusing on what can we invest in that encourages growth and strength and resiliency for the country so that we're not so deeply affected by external global geopolitical, economic, what have you, shocks is really key. And that, we want to be able to encourage discussions and the investment opportunities around that issue. So day one will be focusing on resilient systems. So what kind of investments need to be made to make sure that Vietnam's critical systems, the ecosystem, financial systems, education, training systems, healthcare, are strong, can handle this breakneck pace of growth that we're currently on. And day two is going to be on focusing on resilient supply chain, manufacturing, agriculture, everything from energy to workforce development, and logistics, supply chain, all that due diligence. So building resiliency into that, because we know that the Vietnam's target to position itself as a key, nexus of the global supply chain and move up the value chain is a long-term project. And in order for that to be successful, we need to have resiliency.
Yeah, my next episode will be about supply chain. So that's well-timed, I suppose. Yeah, I still need to get my ticket for the conference as well. Van, was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
No, I think one of the goals from the original conference is still quite there. And I think you heard that through Mimi's description of what we're trying to do in terms of the topics. I think that the conversation between investors and Vietnamese companies and government partners too, they're all coming from it at a different angle, right? And so how do you facilitate a conversation so people can really clearly understand what the opportunities are to work together is something that is going to be an ongoing, goal for us.
Great. That's fantastic. So, Van and Mimi, I know you both have busy days ahead of you. I don't want to take up more of your time. So, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us, Mike.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
And to the audience, come to Vietnam. Come to our investor conference and see how awesome this country is.
That's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate or review the show in your preferred podcast platform and get in touch with any comments or feedback at matatarski@gmail.com. Follow the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, Instagram, or LinkedIn, and sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. The link is in the show notes. See you next week.